This may or may not be a hot take, but The Walking Dead should have ended with Season 8. Now, before you get your torches and pitchforks, let me explain. Look, I'm not here to bash on the show, far from it. I'm one of those people who was totally obsessed with The Walking Dead during its peak. I remember being glued to my screen, biting my nails as characters we loved, and, some we didn't, faced impossible decisions and brutal deaths, and relentless hordes of walkers, and let's not forget the mind games from some of the most iconic villains on TV. Somewhere along the way, after Season 8, things started to change, and not for the better. The show began to feel, well, a little like one of its own zombies, refusing to die and dragging itself across the screen long after it should have stayed down. By Season 8, The Walking Dead had reached a natural perfect ending point, with character arcs fully developed, major conflicts resolved, and a satisfying thematic conclusion. Yet the show kept going, and going, and going. It felt sort of like when you're at a party and it's 2 AM and everyone's had a great time, but you know it's time to head home. Yet instead of leaving, you stay just long enough for things to get weird, for the vibe to die out. That's what the post-Season 8 Walking Dead felt like. A party that should have ended while everyone was still having a good time. So today we're diving deep into why The Walking Dead should have wrapped up with Season 8 and left us with fond memories, rather than overstaying its welcome and leaving many of us feeling like we were just waiting for the credits to find a new role. Now, let's set the stage for a moment and take a trip back to the beginning of The Walking Dead. When it first premiered in 2010, the TV landscape was completely different. The zombies were already a staple of horror, sure, but they were mostly confined to movies. Think The Night of the Living Dead and 28 Days Later. And then here comes The Walking Dead, based on a comic book series but grounded in a world that felt raw, real and brutal. It was like nothing we had seen on TV before, and it wasn't just about zombies, it was about survival, humanity, and what happens when society crumbles. Rick Grimes waking up in that hospital to find the world in chaos. It's iconic. Those first few seasons had us hooked. Constant tension, the moral dilemmas. Who could you trust? How far would you go to protect your people you love? And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, bam, more walkers, more death, and more impossible choices. It was gripping television. But over the years as the seasons went on, something started to change. The initial novelty of a world overrun by zombies faded, and the show began leaning more on the new groups of survivors and human conflicts. Well, that worked for a while because, let's face it, Negan was a charismatic and terrifying villain. It was also the point where many fans, myself included, started wondering just how long the story could keep going. And like I had mentioned before, at the end of Season 8, it felt like we had reached a natural stopping point. Rick Grimes' character arc had come full circle, Negan had been defeated but spared, and the communities were on verge of uniting. It was the perfect moment for the show to say, that's it, we've told our story. But instead, we got several more seasons, new characters and new conflicts that just didn't carry the same weight. So let's break this down step by step. Let's kick things off by talking about the characters, because in the end, it's the characters that made The Walking Dead what it was. Sure, the zombies were cool and the action scenes kept us on edge of our seats, but we tuned in every week because we cared about the people trying to survive in this nightmare of a world. And by the time we reached the end of Season 8, many of those character arcs had either concluded or reached a point where their stories could have ended in a meaningful way. Let's take Rick Grimes as an example. From the moment we met him in the pilot, Rick is the quintessential hero, waking up alone, confused, and thrust into a world he doesn't recognize. His journey is nothing short of epic. He goes from being a small-town sheriff to the leader of a group of survivors to a man who loses everything to someone who's willing to do anything to keep his people safe. We watched him struggle with impossible decisions, lose friends and family, and wrestle with the idea of what it means to be a good man in a world that no longer makes sense. By the end of Season 8, Rick's arc had come full circle. He chose to spare Negan, a man who had taken so much from him, including the life of Glenn, one of Rick's closest friends. And this choice wasn't just about mercy, it was about rebuilding a world where humanity could still exist, even in the face of unimaginable horror. It was the culmination of everything Rick had been through. And it should have been the end of his story, but instead the writers kept him around for another season, only to have him disappear in a helicopter, because, that makes sense in the middle of a zombie apocalypse. And then there's Maggie. If anyone had a right to seek revenge, it was Maggie. After watching Negan brutally murder Glenn, her husband, in one of the most shocking and traumatic scenes in television history, Maggie's journey became one of leadership and grief. She had to navigate her role as leader of Hilltop while grappling with her thirst for vengeance, and by the end of Season 8 she had grown into a powerful leader, someone who can carry on Glenn's legacy while also guiding herself through the challenges ahead. Her arc felt complete. But what happens after Season 8? Well, Maggie's story sort of just gets lost in a sea of new characters and new conflicts, and her role becomes less central to the overall narrative. And what about Daryl Dixon, the crossbow-wielding, motorcycle-riding loner who somehow became the heart of the show? Daryl's journey from an outsider who didn't trust anyone to one of Rick's most trusted allies was one of the most compelling parts of the series. He was the perfect example of a character who didn't need a ton of dialogue or emotional outbursts to be compelling. His actions spoke louder than his words, and his loyalty to Rick and the group was undeniable. But after Season 8, Daryl's character started to stagnate. It was like the writers didn't seem to know what to do with him, and instead of giving him a satisfying conclusion, they just kept throwing him into random situations, hoping that fans would still tune in for their favorite redneck badass. And, of course, we have Michonne, one of the most badass characters to ever wield a katana. Michonne's transformation from a lone wolf to a key member of the group, and eventually Rick's romantic partner, was a powerful journey. She found a family in Rick and his group, and by the end of Season 8, she was in a place where her story could have naturally come to close. But no, the show dragged her story out as well, eventually writing her off in a way that felt rushed and unsatisfying. By Season 8, the key character arcs had reached their peaks. The show had developed these characters to the point where we could see their stories would end. And it would have been a perfect, bittersweet conclusion. But instead of giving these characters the endings they deserved, the writers kept them around, dragging out their stories until they lost the impact they once had. But the characters aren't the only reason I have for why I think The Walking Dead should have ended at Season 8. My second point is the all-out war arc. It was a natural conclusion. Let's be real. This was the climax of the series. The conflict between Rick's group and Negan's saviors had been building for 2 seasons, and by the end of Season 8 we finally got the showdown we've been waiting for. It wasn't just a battle of brawn, it was a battle of ideologies. Negan represented the brutal survival of the fittest mindset, while Rick, despite all they'd been through, still believed that there was room for mercy for humanity. The final confrontation between Rick and Negan wasn't just about who would live or die, it was about what kind of world they were going to build. Would it be one ruled by fear and violence, or one where people could start to rebuild, to trust each other again? Rick's decision to spare Negan was controversial, but it made sense within the context of his character's journey. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore, he was fighting for a future. And that choice marked the end of the war. But more importantly, it marked the end of Rick's internal struggle. He had found a way to move forward, to build a better world, even if it meant sparing the man who had caused him so much pain and suffering. It was a fitting, thematic conclusion, not just a conflict with Negan, but The Walking Dead as a whole. The show had always been about more than just surviving the apocalypse. It was about what kind of people we become when the world falls apart. Rick's decision to spare Negan was the ultimate answer to that question. Mercy, forgiveness, and the hope for a better tomorrow were the ideals the series had been grappling with since its inception. Negan's capture and imprisonment could have been the symbolic end of the violent, chaotic era of the show. It was the moment that allowed the show to reflect on its theme of morality, survival, and leadership. The communities could have come together, not just in triumph over a tyrant, but in the shared goal of rebuilding civilization. And that would have been a satisfying ending. We had seen these characters suffer, fight, and lose so much. Giving them a hopeful but realistic conclusion would have been a reward for both the characters and the fans who stuck with the shows for 8 seasons. What did we get instead? More seasons that felt like they were trying to recapture the magic of earlier conflicts but just couldn't. New antagonists like the Whisperers, while creepy in concept, didn't carry the same emotional or narrative weight as Negan and the Saviors. Sure, the Whisperers introduced a different kind of threat, humans blending in with walkers, living amongst them, but after the intense personal conflict with Negan, it just felt underwhelming. The stakes didn't feel as high, and the emotional investment just wasn't the same. The all-out war arc had everything a series final needs. closure, action, character growth, and thematic solution. By stretching the story beyond that, The Walking Dead lost the tight narrative focus that had made it so compelling in the first place. Now, let's talk about something that affects every long-running show: fan fatigue. It's real, and it definitely set in during The Walking Dead. By the time we had reached season 8, a lot of fans were already feeling like the show had been stretched thin. The same patterns kept repeating: new communities, new villains, internal conflict, external threats, rinse and repeat. It started to feel like the show was spinning its wheels, trying to keep the audience invested with bigger and badder threats, but without the emotional depth that the original drawn people in. And here's the thing, you can only watch a group of survivors face off against so many morally grey enemies before it starts to feel redundant. Each new group introduced after season 8, whether it was the Whisperers, the Commonwealth, or any other faction, felt like a variation on a theme that we'd already seen. How many times can you have the humans are the real monsters conversation before it starts to lose its punch? The show's early seasons were groundbreaking because they were unpredictable. Characters we loved could die at any point. The world was unforgiving and every episode felt like it had real stakes. But by season 9 and beyond, that unpredictability was gone. We knew the show wasn't going to kill off certain key characters because it was holding onto them for too long. The tension that once made the show so exciting started to dissipate. And this isn't just my opinion either. Look at the ratings. The show's viewership steadily declined after season 8, and while it still had a dedicated fan base, the cultural conversation around the show became quieter. At its peak, The Walking Dead was a phenomenon. People would gather to watch live, Twitter would explode with reactions, and every episode felt like a major event. But after season 8, it started to feel like the show was just there. It wasn't a must-see TV anymore. It was just something you caught up on when you had the time, or maybe even let pile up in your DVR for months before bringing. The urgency was gone. There's a principle in storytelling called diminishing returns, and The Walking Dead is a textbook example of it. When a show drags on past its natural endpoint, each new conflict, each new storyline delivers less impact than the one before. The emotional highs of earlier seasons were hard to replicate because the show had already explored so many avenues. The same tension and stakes that felt fresh in the first few seasons just couldn't be captured as effectively. And you can literally see this play out in other long-running shows too. Think about Game of Thrones. While that show had its own issues with rushing its final seasons, the point is that every story has an endpoint. Stretching it out beyond that doesn't increase the value of the story, it dilutes it. The Walking Dead was at its best when it focused on the core group of survivors and their personal emotional struggles. By extending the series well beyond season 8, the show lost the intimate character-driven focus that had made it so engaging in the first place. Another issue with dragging the show out after season 8 is that it led to a lot of lingering plot threads that never got satisfying resolutions. With new characters and new storylines being introduced every season, it became harder for the show to maintain a clear, focused narrative. We went from following a relatively tight-knit group of survivors in the earlier seasons to managing multiple storylines across different communities and locations. This fragmentation meant that certain characters and plot points were left hanging for episodes, or even seasons at a time. Think about characters like Morgan or Carol, who had some of the most compelling character developments in the earlier seasons. By the time we reached season 9 and beyond, these characters felt sidelined and underutilized. Morgan, for example, went from being a central figure in Rick's life, someone whose journey from pacifism to violence was a key part of the show's exploration of morality, to disappearing into a side story that took him away from the main group. And while I know he's got his own spin-off with Fear of the Walking Dead, that doesn't change the fact that his story felt unfinished in the main series. And Carol too went through an incredible growth throughout the series, from an abused wife to one of the toughest, most capable survivors in the group. But after season 8, her character seemed to drift without a clear direction. She had already faced her demons, made peace with her past, and emerged as a leader. Instead of giving her a definitive conclusion, the show kept her around, but without the same focus or emotional weight. And then there's the question of new characters. After season 8, the show introduced a slew of new survivors, each with their own backstories, of course, and also motivations and interpersonal dynamics. But here's the problem: by this point, many viewers were already deeply invested in the original characters, and these new introductions felt more like distractions than compelling additions. Instead of deepening the emotional stakes, they diluted them. The show tried to juggle too many plot lines, and as a result, none of them hit as hard as they could have. At the end of the day, The Walking Dead could have gone out on a high note with season 8. It had everything it needed for a satisfying conclusion: strong character arcs, thematic closure, and a conflict that had been built up over multiple seasons. Instead, it kept going, adding more characters, more conflicts, and more seasons that didn't pack the same punch. By dragging out the series, the showrunners risked turning what was once a groundbreaking must-watch show into something that overstayed its welcome. Fans who had been deeply invested in the story and characters were left feeling fatigued, while the ratings steadily declined. The emotional highs of earlier seasons gave way to diminishing returns as the show stretched beyond its natural endpoint. Would fans have been upset if The Walking Dead ended with season 8? Sure, probably. We all want more of what we love, but sometimes it's better to end on a high note than to leave the audience wanting more rather than dragging things out until they lose interest. So, there you have it. Why The Walking Dead should have been wrapped up with season 8. I'm sure there are plenty of opinions out there, so let me know what you think. Should the show have ended earlier, or are you one of the fans who stuck with it until the very end? Either way, it's been a wild ride through the apocalypse, but sometimes it's best to know when to say goodbye. Thanks for sticking with me through my rant, analysis of why The Walking Dead overstayed its welcome. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. And of course, drop a comment below to let me know your thoughts on the show. Did it go on for too long, or are you still hanging in there with the spin-offs? Let's chat about it in the comments. Until next time, stay safe out there and watch out for walkers.